Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Jakobi Williams, to discuss the Illinois Black Panther Party. Dr. Williams is an associate professor of history and African American studies at Indiana University. He has done extensive research and published several works on U.S. history, especially addressing contributions and experiences of African Americans, which have normally been avoided or ignored. He's received numerous fellowships and awards, including from the National Endowment for Humanities, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, and the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. Today we're going to discuss his book, From the Bullet to the Ballot, the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, and Racial Coalition Politics in Chicago. I agree with some of the commentaries on the back. This is one of the most significant, exhaustively researched, comprehensive, and insightful studies of Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party in Chicago. He provides details about the FBI, the Chicago police, and the Daley administration in the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark in December of '69. But he goes beyond that single racist event to unpack the conditions, the experiences, and the resistance by the black community, groups, youth gangs, and the growth and power of the Black Panther Party. Welcome today, Dr. Williams.
Thanks for having me.
I got to tell you, this was a pleasure to read, a joy to read. Anybody that can recover events like the Lowndes County Freedom Now Party and Robert F. Williams, or St. Clair Drake, or the Young Socialist Alliance, or Stokely and Snick, I mean, thank you for your thoroughness. I think this should be read by everyone, anyone that's interested in the era of black power in American history and that whole era. Let's begin with a simple question. You wrote the whole book about it. But why is the dominant image even today? Black Panthers, they're in their leather jackets, they got their berets, they got a fist, maybe a gun. Why does that remain the dominant image of the Panthers?
Everyone has to have a symbol. Iconography is key. And the Panthers understood that branding and the ways in which the media pretty much identified and documented most of what they were involved in, to identify exactly who was involved and who wasn't, with all the various movements that was taking place at that time. Yeah. And that was their moniker, the iconography. It's also part of the black aesthetic of the Black Power movement, being black and proud of one's hair, one's features, one's heritage, and their position was unapologetically black, hence the beret and the leather jackets and the Black Power fist.
This comes at the end of, in the middle of the Civil Rights Movement, where there's a move from the NAACP and to talking about black, reappropriating a term and using it for pride. So I think that's significant. And one of the things that I found striking about the book was you talk a lot about the programs that the Panthers implemented, which is, in addition to their iconography, their appearance, they also did actions that were very, increased their credibility within the black communities. You called them survival programs.
Well,
maybe you could talk,
survival programs,
okay, yeah. Survival program, as opposed to service or charity work. I mean, Hampton made a big deal that this isn't charity, this is a transition. So maybe you could talk about a few of those programs.
Okay. Perfect. So, and I'm glad we start there, because most of the misconceptions we have of the party is the iconography, it is the leather jacket, it is the beret, but the legacy of this organization are those survival programs, those community service programs, and they call it survival pending revolution. So they're arguing for a revolution in this period, historical context, of all these various movements at the time. Civil rights, black power, anti-war, women's movement, student movement, the list goes on.
And globally.
And globally, right?
Yes.
And it's the height of the Cold War. At the same time, we're fighting a hot war in Vietnam.
Yep.
So the Panthers are a revolutionary socialist organization. So they're advocating for revolution. But what they argue is that as African Americans who are poor, that they themselves can't demand a revolution. The people must. So they use these survival programs, how do we survive until we have a revolution, pending revolution, to highlight the contradictions of capitalism. So they create all these programs. The first one they created, of course, is the Free Breakfast for Children's program. And they argue that most of these children in most of these impoverished communities, particularly African Americans, could not focus and concentrate in school because they were hungry. And so they began to feed folks, not just in Oakland, but in Chicago. Chicago alone was feeding almost 5,000 people a day. before school, black, white, or otherwise, these youth. And then they create a whole host of service programs, many of which the United States government and even local governments end up adopting as things that they needed. And so free legal aid and from free clinics and things like that. And it's a whole host of them. They have almost 40 different programs: free breakfast, free food, free shoe, what they call liberation schools. Today we call them charter schools. They're creating all these particular issues. And because of the ways in which they were so integral, the United States government created the Child Nutrition Act. Now we have free breakfast and free school and lunches in schools now. What makes Chicago so unique is when they created their free clinics. They had the Cook County Health Commissioner, Quentin Young, was actually the person who oversaw all of their free health clinics. And what made those particular programs so important is how they created these coalitions. They used those programs to bring others, poor people, into the fold. And so then the people themselves were highlighting the contradictions of capitalism by using these programs. Keyword is free, right? Free breakfast, free health care,
free legal aid,
right? Free busing to prison, and all these various free programs, free ambulance service, free plumbing, free liberation schools. So all this free, of highlighting those contradictions.
One of the things that there was a quote in here from Fred Hampton where he said it was to educate to liberate.
Educate to liberate.
Which, and this, even those actions, which are separate from what you might see on nightly TV or in some high school textbook about the Panthers, again, that icon, as opposed to the survival programs. The educate to liberate was, you're in the richest country in the world, and kids are going hungry. You're in the richest country in the world, and people can't get tested for sickle cell
or
anemia.
Decent education.
All that list. So the very actions by themselves were educational. The fact that they would undertake these things and then people would come and they'd see the Panthers standing there, which had to be impressive. But they're also doing the schools, and just the very fact that they're feeding people, and the city or the state or the federal government can't.
Was not at that time.
Yeah.
So eventually they began to adopt them. But yes, so the Panthers are arguing that observation and participation is another slogan they would use. So I usually use my grandmother's example, right? My grandmother bless her soul, has passed away. She is a devout Christian. And the Panthers are doing fundraising by selling Chairman Mao's The Red Book. So my grandmother would never read the Red Book. Right? She reads the Bible. She can care less about revolutionary socialism. However, the Panthers say, well, come on, Miss Mama Smith, come on down to the free clinic and see the kind of work that we're doing. Look at our free breakfast program and see the kind of work that we do in the community service. And before you know it, my grandmother and others in the church would take over those particular programs and begin to run them. And so what the Panthers, particularly Fred, would say that you can't tell people what socialism is. You have to show them. And so they may reject it, but once they begin to participate in it, then everyone sees this is something we should be doing anyway, and they end up investing and end up taking over those particular programs.
Yeah. Well, that to me is one of the powers of the Panthers and the power of the book is that it shows that change came because there was a form of resistance, there was a form of action. It wasn't waiting for some particular hero or leader to come up, but you're actually doing this, and then the participation of the community makes it more, makes it stronger. Yes. And the interesting thing is that's when the city decides to do some of these things. That's when the school decides to do some of these things. That's when the state and the federal government decide they need to do these things because other people are doing it and it's having an impact on how they're understanding capitalism or racism or daily life. So
it's perfect. So what makes the Panthers so important is they're not just teaching self-determination to poor African Americans, they're teaching it to all poor people, regardless of race, to transcend the so-called racial divide.
Well, we want to get to this. We want to get to this.
And so those programs are key.
Yeah, and I want to get to that point that you're doing. I got one more question before we get there, because it was a Black Panther Party for self-defense. And again, the image and the history is, to some extent, even the film, the Judas and the
Black Messiah.
Yeah, which I didn't enjoy, to tell the truth, but that's a separate question.
Neither did I.
But self-defense, and the idea is there would be a shootout. But I would understand that the Black Panthers, when they were talking about self-defense, it wasn't always pulling a gun or doing a sniping at a cop on the corner, but it involved the participation of the community. led by the Panthers. So could you talk about some of the tactics or some of the actions that would kind of defend the community?
So they use self-defense deliberately, because we have this misconception that to defend oneself makes one violent. And so this is the term is deliberately used because of the dichotomy we get between civil rights versus black power, or nonviolent civil disobedience versus self-defense. And somehow we got this misconception that self-defense equates violence. No, self-defense is a human response. So often in my classes, when I teach this material, I ask my students, if I'm the authority in the room, like in the community, maybe a police officer or someone, and I decide I want to get up and just slap everyone in the room, would you let me slap you? 90% of the people would defend themselves.
Right.
Now, does that make you violent? No. That makes me the assailant, the violent one. You're defending yourself. That's a natural human response. So they're using that term as an attention getter to teach the community you have a right to defend yourself, and it's protected by the Constitution, and it's a human right. So they use that deliberately for that reason. Now, in certain places, in Oakland, for example, where the Panthers national headquarters is located, where they started, they do police to police. But you can't do that in a city like Chicago.
Especially at that time,
Chicago is the second largest
city
in the nation, and if you arm yourself and police those police, you're gonna have some shootouts. And so some depends on where we are. So we got this misconception that what's true of the macrocosm is true of the microcosm. And so what I try to do with this book is separate Chicago from Oakland to show the commonalities, but also show the differences. That the best way to understand the Panthers is from the local perspective up. That every chapter is different and unique based on its particular location. So Oakland can get away with some things that Chicago wouldn't even try.
One of the anecdotes that you have in there, I don't know if it's an anecdote, but you're talking about the Young Patriot organization, the Appalachia, and at a certain point, Robert E. Lee III, which is kind of an interesting little, but Bob Lee, who's a Panther organizer, is working, I guess he goes to an event, and he ends up being on the same platform in the church with
Church of Three Crosses on the north side of Chicago.
Redneck country boys. But he says that's the first time he ever saw white people picking on white people, and he felt he had to defend the poor white people against the rich white people. But afterwards, apparently somebody called the police, and they came and they arrested Bob Lee, the Panther. But he said what happened was the people from the Young Patriots went outside and provided essentially self-defense for Bob Lee. They surrounded the police car, and they stood in front of the police car, and the only way they would have had to run over these white people on the north side, which anyway, they released Bob Lee. And it struck me that that's a form of defense as well. I mean, nowadays it would be taking a video of the assault, like we know has happened recently.
It's community driven.
Community driven.
And it's also part of those two slogans we mentioned earlier: educate to liberate, observation and participation. And so when folks observe, then you participate. You educate, and people understand how to get involved in their liberation. So that's a perfect example of how the community, this poor southern white migrants from places from the foothills of West Virginia down to the foothills of Alabama, these Appalachian mountains and so forth, and these poor, impoverished, what they will call derogatory hillbillies, are out here defending this African-American man in one of the most racially, residentially segregated cities in America at this point, who's a Panther, right? So that demonstrates the power that again, observation, participation, and educate to liberate can have on communities once you teach them self-determination and what self-defense actually looks like.
Well, the self-defense,
socialism.
Yes, the self-defense was the physical defense, but it also could be the legal aid, because when people would get arrested, they would come to the defense and find the lawyers and get to know the law.
And you had numerous movement lawyers, if we're talking about Chicago. Chicago is what I call National Headquarters East, because they just had so much happening in that city that just didn't happen wasn't as successful or consistent in most other places.
Much bigger than Oakland,
It's the second largest city in America at this time. It's the third now, but then it was the second largest. And so, when you have movement lawyers, you have the Cook County Health Commissioner running your clinics, you have all these various campaigns of folks who believe in what they're doing, participate in self-defense, in these various forms of self-defense in different ways as well.
So, we're bumping up against this next subject, because you're talking about the legacies of the Panthers. One is their survival programs and how it affected social services from state and national
federal
programs. The other is, which is in the title of the book, racial coalition politics. And again, most people don't know the history of the Panthers, particularly in Chicago, or it also happened in Houston, it happened in other cities, New York, where they were able to make these connections.
Yes.
And so maybe you can talk about this. I mentioned the Young Patriots, which was Appalachia, the Young Lords, which were Puerto Rican and Mexican American to some extent. Also the gangs, like the Blackstone Rangers and other gangs, they bring this coalition together. What's the other? Rising Up Angry?
Rise Up Angry.
You called them greasers in the book, and I don't know what that meant, so I'll let you expand on that. But we're talking about a coalition here of Appalachian whites, whites in Logan Square, the Puerto Rican community, Mexican American community, and the Panthers are coming together, and they're sharing the breakfast programs, they're sharing the health clinics, they're sharing the defense, all those. Yes. So how does this unwind, I guess?
Well, the critical mover and shaker here is Bob Lee. I can't talk about the coalition without talking about the glue. And it was Bob Lee. So Chicago is a city of migrants. Everyone's moving from somewhere. So we have 2 black migrations to Chicago, not to give you that history, but Fred Hampton is part of the second migration, for example. Most of the Panthers are. And then you have these Appalachian whites and others who are migrating to Chicago looking for economic opportunities. Well, so are Puerto Ricans coming from the East Coast and the island Puerto Rico, moving to Chicago looking for these opportunities. And then groups like Rise Up Angry or Students for Democratic Society and others who are part of the Student Left.
Young Socialist Alliance,
which I
had not seen in the book.
All these people are moving from various places, and then they culminate in Chicago, and then the DNC happens. And then once the DNC happens, then
the Democratic National Convention,
1968.
Okay.
And then that was the firebread that really gets the political turmoils and blood boiling of all these organizations to begin to work in coalition. But it's Bob Lee who's the moving shaker. He's the one who brings the Appalachian community into the fold. He's an African American from Houston, Texas. His name is Robert E. Lee III. But he's named after his grandfather, not the Confederate general. Yeah. But these poor Appalachian white migrants find that hilarious, right? So that's I guess the icebreaker, so to speak. And so he begins to organize them. At that same time, Fred Hampton is organizing the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican community at that time in Lincoln Park. So they're facing many of the same critical issues African Americans are. They're being displaced by urban renewal and gentrification. They're fighting to keep their community intact. And so together, those are the Rainbow Coalition, the Young Patriots, the Panthers, and the Young Lords. Rise Up Angry comes later, but the nexus are those 3. So Bob Lee brings in the Patriots, Fred Hampton brings in Cha-Cha Jimenez and Young Lords. The Young Lords are actually a gang. Much like the Appalachians, these are just poor white communities who are organizing against the kind of police brutality and poverty. Yeah. And so the Panthers and the poor black community are dealing with the same issues: police brutality, repression, urban renewal, gentrification, lack of education, jobs, and the list goes on. Housing disparities and so forth and so on. Well, so are Puerto Ricans. And so Fred Hampton brings the Young Lords, Bob Lee brings in the Patriots together. Fred Hampton becomes his de facto leader because he's just so charismatic. Mm-hmm. And they began to organize these coalitions together. Now, it sounds great, right? Maybe they can just put those so-called racial differences to bed in the second largest city in America, the most racially, residentially segregated city then, and still is today.
Still is now, yes.
Sounds good. No. The Panthers have programs. Without those programs, there is no coalition. So the Panthers can actually go in and solve some of the critical issues.
You're demonstrating in action what the coalition means.
It's not a theory into practice is what they're saying. The Panthers would say, the Panthers would spend 16 hours a day, 8 hours in the classroom, learning all this theory, law, trying to figure out how to solve their problems. And then the next 8 hours a day, actually putting that theory into practice in these survival programs, community service programs. So just think about that. 8 hours in the classroom, 8 hours doing community service, but then they get dubbed as this anti-white organization. They don't have time to hate anyone. It's too much work to be done, right? Too much reading and service. Don't have another 8 hours, you better be sleeping or eating. You don't have time to hate white people. So they're out doing this kind of work, and they're transcending these racial differences. So for them, it's not that race is important, but they see race as a product of capitalism. These are socialist. It's a socialist movement.
Well, right. Yes.
Right. The government dubs them the greatest threat to the internal security of the nation because of the programs, because the programs work. And if they were just organizing poor little black folks, the government would be fine. But no, they're organizing all poor people, regardless of race. And that's what made them the greatest threat to the internal security of the nation. And the FBI and the local police department, the Red Squad and others, targeted them for assassination, exile, false imprisonment, because they saw that as the threat to capitalism in the Cold War. We can't divorce this from the Cold War. We're having a Cold War, and we're losing hearts and minds. You have all these international revolutionary proletariat struggles happening around the nation, around the world, and people are winning in Africa, in the Caribbean, Latin America, Asia, and here we are in the States saying, how do we as black people get involved in that? And the countries, when these countries win their sovereignty, they're not looking to America as a model. So we're losing the Cold War. At the same time, you have the Panthers in these programs. So the government sees this as an assault against the capitalist structure, which is what it is. They believe in America. Don't get me wrong. The Panthers and the coalition, they argue that America can never live up to its ideals of a democracy under the auspices of capitalism. So they advocated socialism as a more equitable solution because everyone that's getting their freedom around the world are creating socialist economies. Some of them even go out communist. But so most of them keep their democracies, but they all reject capitalism, and the Panthers are no different. So when they're in the classroom, this is what they're studying. They're reading Ho Chi Minh, they're reading Che Guevara, they're reading Frantz Fanon. They're reading Maya Angelou, Martin Luther King, Malcolm. They're reading all this stuff and trying to figure out what's going on with the ANC in South Africa. How do we apply these issues to what's going on in Palestine and so forth and so on. They're reading this and trying to figure out how do we, as people oppressed in America, get involved in our freedom struggle in a different context. So they see socialism as a way of doing it. And then they argue that if we as black people, the Panthers, march on this state and claim to be revolutionary, they're gonna make us to be terrorists. So we can't do that. The people have to demand a revolution. So what do? We create programs and teach all poor people about these programs. So to highlight the contradictions of capitalism, then maybe the people themselves will rise up and demand a revolution, then the Panthers will lead that. Now, one final point. We always divorce Martin Luther King from this conversation. Martin Luther King is front and center in this conversation.
He's become an icon as well. I mean, he's stopped
in this period.
Yes. I mean, at the end, he's against the war in Vietnam. He's against capitalism.
He's leading a march on Washington called the Poor People's Campaign against capitalism.
Well, he got shot
he
in
never
Memphis.
got to lead because he gets assassinated. So the Panthers pick up the mantra, and they see themselves continuing King's work, and this is what this coalition is all about. Continue King's dream, that he also sees capitalism as a problem. King also is a democratic socialist, is what he is. He demonstrates that America can't live up to his ideals of democracy under capitalism either. And so he wants to lead his campaign. The Panthers pick up the mantle, and they take it further than he is. Not even King could get Confederate flag Southern whites to march arm in arm with him and do security for him and put their lives on the line for him.
What did you say, the preacher man, Fesser man, the head of the...
Preacher man, Fesserman, yes.
Yeah, he's got a Confederate flag on
That's their symbol. They don't divorce. And so the Panthers ignore that symbol. They look past it. What's some Panthers? I shouldn't say all, because they had to purge some Panthers from the organization because they just couldn't look past that racist symbol. It is. So the Panthers are arguing, let them have it, because we have a larger agenda, which is a revolution to overthrow the capitalist structure. Not to overthrow America, to overthrow the capitalism as a structure that's exploitative for all people, regardless of race.
A recurrent theme in the book is how there's changes that take place, and the changes are the actions that the Panthers do or the Rainbow Coalition does with Appalachia and the Puerto Ricans, and there would be changes, and then there would be responses.
But there's change over time. So I want to be clear and I need to be more clear when I talk about this organization, when I'm talking about them and what period it is. Because there's change over time. So at the height of the Rainbow Coalition, at the height of the party, prior to Fred Hampton's assassination, there's real fervor around the nation that there's a possible revolution. Revolution is in the street, it's in the air. Everyone's saying these words. And the government themselves, when Nixon campaigns on it, right? About law and order, he sees a revolution too. His Secretary of State says, there's a revolution happening. Now who's gonna win, us or them? And they began to use that heavy hand to break the law, repress folks.
At the same time, Nixon was president when the Open Housing Act was passed. I mean, Nixon was president when they actually desegregated the schools in the South.
And he's saying
well, that's precisely the point. point, that they have to because there's this pressure, this movement, this resistance, and you aren't doing it because you want to, you're doing it because you have to, and you hope it'll take the
And simultaneously, he gives the FBI the the gloves off to kill, and what he called neutralize the organization. And that same year, you have 19 Panthers murdered. The first 2 are in a classroom at UCLA in Campbell Hall, Bunty Carter and John Huggins, fighting for the creation of a Black Studies program. And the last one that year was Fred Hampton in December 4th, 1969. So you get 19 leaders across the nation assassinated by the hands of the federal government and the FBI under the directive of Richard Nixon.
And we certainly should discuss it some more, but I'd like to end with the note of the legacy of the Panthers, which was the survival program, the coalition politics, and the actual active resistance that they proposed. That power to the people, I guess, would be the way that we need to end. That's all the time we have on our program. I want to thank Dr. Williams for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. I'll see you next time.